The email notification pinged just as Marcus reached for his morning coffee, but what he saw on the screen made his hand freeze midair. There, in bold letters across his laptop display, was a termination notice from the Department of Defense. Effective immediately due to security breach and unauthorized disclosure of classified information. His stomach dropped like a stone through water. He hadn't disclosed anything. He hadn't even been at work yesterday, having taken a personal day to help his sister Vanessa finalize wedding arrangements. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The timestamp showed the email had been sent at 3:47 a.m. Someone had been working very early or very late to make sure this hit his inbox before he could defend himself. Marcus scrolled through the formal language, each line feeling like a punch to the gut. 23 words jumped out at him like neon signs in the darkness. Credible evidence suggests intentional sharing of sensitive materials with unauthorized civilian contractors through personal communication channels. His security clearance, the one he'd spent 8 years building, was suspended pending investigation. His access to the building where he'd worked for the past 4 years was revoked. His government-issued laptop and phone needed to be returned within 24 hours. Just like that, his career in cybersecurity for the Defense Intelligence Agency was over, and he had absolutely no idea why. Marcus stared at the screen until the words blurred together. This wasn't possible. He'd never shared classified information with anyone, let alone civilian contractors. The closest he'd come to discussing work outside the office was telling his girlfriend Elena that he couldn't talk about what he did, which she'd grown to accept over their 2 years together. His sister knew he worked in government tech, but that was the extent of it. Even his parents thought he was just another IT guy pushing papers in a cubicle. The phone rang, jarring him from his paralysis. Marcus glanced at the caller ID and saw his supervisor's name. He answered on the second ring. "Marcus? I need you to come in immediately." Director Harrison's voice was clipped, professional, the warmth that usually colored their interactions completely absent. "We need to discuss this situation." "Sir, I don't understand what's happening. I haven't." "Not over the phone. Building 7, conference room C. 1 hour." The line went dead. Marcus sat in the silence of his Arlington apartment, surrounded by the life he'd built so carefully. His diplomas hung on the wall, his security clearance certificates in frames beside them. The American flag his grandfather had given him when he first got the government job stood in the corner. Everything felt suddenly foreign, like props in someone else's play. He showered and dressed in his best suit, the navy one Vanessa had helped him pick out for her engagement party last year. As he knotted his tie, he caught his reflection in the mirror. At 34, he had always prided himself on his steady reputation, his clean record, his unwavering integrity. Those things had gotten him promoted twice in 4 years and earned him respect from colleagues who'd been in intelligence work since before he was born. Now someone was saying he'd thrown it all away, and he couldn't even fathom how. The drive to the DIA facility in Washington took 43 minutes through morning traffic, giving Marcus plenty of time to replay every interaction he'd had over the past few months. Had he said something to Elena over dinner that could have been misconstrued? Had he left his laptop open somewhere? Had someone gained access to his email? The possibilities churned through his mind like clothes in a washing machine, tumbling over each other without resolution. Security at the building was different. Instead of his usual friendly nod from the guards who'd known him for years, he was subjected to additional screening. His temporary visitor pass was granted only after phone calls made behind closed doors and minutes of waiting. His badge felt like a scarlet letter as he made his way to conference room C. Director Harrison was waiting with 2 people Marcus didn't recognize, a stern woman in a charcoal suit and a man who had the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement. "Marcus, sit down." Harrison gestured to the chair across from them. "This is Agent Patricia Walsh from the FBI's Counterintelligence Division and Agent David Chen from our Internal Security Office." Marcus's mouth went dry. FBI. This wasn't just about losing his job anymore. Agent Walsh opened a thick folder and placed a photograph on the table. It showed Marcus at a coffee shop, sitting across from a woman with short blonde hair. The timestamp indicated it was taken 3 weeks ago. Marcus recognized the location immediately. It was near Vanessa's wedding venue, where they'd met to discuss final preparations. "Do you recognize this woman?" Agent Walsh asked. Marcus squinted at the photo. The woman looked vaguely familiar, but he couldn't place her. "I'm sorry, I don't think so." "This is Katrina Volkov," Agent Chen said. "She works for Meridian Consulting, a firm that's been flagged for potential intelligence gathering on behalf of foreign interests." The room seemed to tilt. Marcus had never heard of Meridian Consulting, and he certainly didn't know anyone named Katrina Volkov. "I don't understand. I've never met this person." "According to our investigation," Agent Walsh continued, "you've had multiple meetings with Miss Volkov over the past 2 months. Phone records show 17 calls between your personal cell phone and a number registered to her. Email metadata indicates you've exchanged over 40 messages." Marcus felt like he was drowning in confusion. "That's impossible. I would remember meeting someone, especially 17 phone calls. Can you show me the phone records?" Agent Chen slid another document across the table. There it was, in black and white. His phone number, dates, times, call durations. The longest call had lasted 47 minutes. Marcus stared at the numbers, his mind racing. These calls had allegedly happened, but he had no memory of them whatsoever. "There's more," Director Harrison said, his voice heavy with what sounded like disappointment. "We've identified classified information in Miss Volkov's possession that could only have come from someone with your level of access. Sir, I swear to you, I have never shared classified information with anyone. I don't even know who this woman is." Agent Walsh leaned forward. "Marcus, we have evidence suggesting otherwise. The question now is whether you're willing to cooperate with our investigation." The word cooperate hung in the air like a threat. Marcus understood what they were really asking, whether he was going to confess to something he hadn't done or maintain his innocence and face the full weight of a federal investigation. "I want to cooperate," he said carefully, "but I need you to understand that I haven't done anything wrong. Someone has made a mistake, or worse, someone has set me up." The three officials exchanged glances. Agent Chen made a note in his file. "We'll need you to surrender your government devices and any materials you may have taken from the workplace." Marcus spent the next 3 hours being debriefed, signing forms, and watching his career systematically dismantled. They escorted him to his office to collect personal items under supervision as if he were a criminal who might steal government secrets on his way out. His colleagues avoided eye contact, whispers following him down the hallway like a toxic cloud. By noon, he was unemployed, under federal investigation, and completely bewildered about how his life had imploded in the span of a morning. The drive home felt surreal. Marcus stopped at a red light and noticed a man in a sedan 2 cars behind him. When the light changed, the sedan followed. At the next light, it was still there. Marcus made an unnecessary turn into a shopping center, and the sedan continued straight. Paranoia, he told himself, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Apartment, Marcus sat at his kitchen table and tried to make sense of the evidence against him. Someone had been using his phone number to communicate with a suspected foreign intelligence operative. Someone had been meeting with this woman and using his identity. But who? And why? He pulled out his personal laptop and started researching Katrina Volkov and Meridian Consulting. The company's website looked legitimate enough: corporate consulting, business development, strategic planning, generic language that could mean anything or nothing. Katrina's LinkedIn profile showed an impressive education and work history, but something about it felt manufactured, too perfect. Marcus was deep in his research when his phone rang. Vanessa's name appeared on the screen, and he felt a wave of relief. His sister would understand this was all a mistake. She'd known him his entire life and would never believe he was capable of treason. "Marcus, oh my God, are you okay?" Her voice was breathless, worried. "I just heard from Mom that something happened at work." "I'm in trouble, Nessa, big trouble. Someone has framed me for sharing classified information, but I swear I didn't do it." There was a pause. "Of course you didn't. This is insane. What can I do to help?" Marcus felt tears of gratitude prick his eyes. "I don't know yet. I might need a lawyer. I might need character references. This could get really ugly really fast." "Whatever you need," Vanessa said firmly. "We're family. We stick together." After hanging up, Marcus felt marginally better. At least someone believed in his innocence. He spent the rest of the day documenting everything he could remember about his recent activities, trying to find any connection to the mysterious Katrina Volkov. That evening, Elena came over with Chinese takeout and a bottle of wine. She listened patiently as he explained the situation, asking thoughtful questions and offering support. But Marcus could see the concern in her eyes, the way she processed each detail as if calculating the potential impact on their relationship. "The timing is terrible," he said, picking at his lo mein. "Vanessa's wedding is this Saturday. The last thing she needs is this drama overshadowing her big day." Elena nodded. "Maybe that's for the best, though. You can focus on being there for her, and maybe the investigation will sort itself out while you're distracted." Marcus hoped she was right, but something told him this was only the beginning. The next few days passed in a haze of legal consultations and mounting anxiety. Marcus hired Patricia Morrison, a defense attorney who specialized in security clearance cases. She was expensive, but her reputation was solid, and she didn't seem fazed by the charges against him. "These cases are often built on circumstantial evidence," she explained during their first meeting. "The government wants to show a pattern of behavior, but patterns can be manufactured. We need to find out who had access to your personal information and how they used it." Marcus provided her with everything: phone records, email logs, his work schedule, his personal calendar. Morrison's investigators would cross-reference everything to build a timeline of his actual activities versus the alleged meetings with Katrina Volkov. Meanwhile, the FBI investigation continued. Agents interviewed his neighbors, his colleagues, even Elena. Marcus felt like a pariah, watching his reputation crumble in real time. The local news hadn't picked up the story yet, but in the small world of intelligence work, word traveled fast. Friday evening, the night before Vanessa's wedding, Marcus sat in his apartment reviewing Morrison's preliminary findings. Her investigators had discovered some interesting discrepancies in the phone records. Several of the alleged calls between Marcus and Katrina had occurred while Marcus was provably somewhere else, at the dentist, at a work meeting with multiple witnesses, once while he was giving a presentation to a room full of people. "Someone has been spoofing your phone number," Morrison had explained. "It's more sophisticated than typical fraud," which suggests this isn't random. Someone specifically targeted you. But who? And why? Marcus had no enemies that he knew of. His work was important, but not particularly high profile. He wasn't involved in any controversial projects or sensitive operations that would make him a target for foreign intelligence services. The wedding was tomorrow, and Marcus was determined not to let his problems ruin Vanessa's day. He'd smile, make toasts, dance with relatives, and pretend his world wasn't falling apart. His sister deserved that much. Saturday morning dawned clear and bright, perfect weather for an outdoor ceremony. Marcus put on his rented tuxedo and drove to the Willowbrook Country Club in Virginia, where Vanessa had dreamed of getting married since she was 16. The venue was elegant without being ostentatious, with manicured gardens and a view of the Potomac River that would make for stunning photographs. Marcus arrived early to help with last-minute preparations. The wedding party was buzzing with excitement, final arrangements being coordinated by the wedding planner with military precision. Vanessa looked radiant in her dress, her happiness infectious despite everything weighing on Marcus's mind. "You clean up nice, big brother," she said, adjusting his boutonniere. "Thank you for being here. I know this week has been hell for you." "Wouldn't miss it for anything," Marcus replied, meaning every word. "This is your day. Nothing else matters." The ceremony was beautiful. Vanessa and her fiancé David exchanged vows they'd written themselves, bringing tears to many eyes in the audience. Marcus stood at the altar as the best man, watching his sister marry the love of her life, and for a moment he forgot about federal investigations and career destruction. This was what mattered: family, love, commitment. The reception began with cocktails on the terrace, followed by dinner in the main ballroom. Marcus gave his speech as planned, sharing funny stories about growing up with Vanessa and welcoming David to the family. The crowd laughed and applauded, and Marcus felt almost normal for the first time in a week. But normalcy was about to shatter in the most spectacular way possible. Marcus was at the bar ordering another drink when he noticed them: two men in dark suits standing near the entrance to the ballroom, scanning the crowd with the systematic attention of law enforcement. His blood ran cold. They weren't wedding guests. He'd seen enough federal agents over the years to recognize the type.
One of them spotted Marcus and whispered something to his partner. They began moving through the crowd, polite but purposeful, heading directly toward him. Marcus set down his drink and tried to think. This couldn't be happening. Not here. Not at Vanessa's wedding. Whatever they wanted, surely it could wait until Monday. But as the agents got closer, Marcus realized this wasn't about him at all. They walked past him without a glance and continued toward the head table, where the wedding party was seated. Marcus followed at a distance, his heart pounding. The lead agent approached the table and spoke quietly to David, Vanessa's new husband. Marcus couldn't hear the conversation over the music and chatter, but he saw David's face go pale. Vanessa looked confused, then alarmed. Marcus pushed through the crowd, arriving at the table just as David stood up. "I need to speak with you privately," the agent was saying. "What's this about?" Vanessa demanded, her voice cutting through the ambient noise. "Ma'am, if you could please remain seated. We just need a moment with your husband." David looked at Vanessa, then at Marcus, his face a mask of confusion and growing panic. "I don't understand. What's happening?" The lead agent showed his badge discreetly. "Special Agent Rodriguez, United States Secret Service. We need to discuss some irregularities regarding your employment with Meridian Consulting." The world tilted on its axis. David worked for Meridian Consulting, the same company that employed Katrina Volkov, the woman Marcus
Had allegedly been meeting with, the woman who had classified information that could only have come from someone with Marcus's clearance level. Marcus felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. David, his new brother-in-law, the man who just married his sister, was connected to the company that had destroyed his career. "There must be some mistake," David said, his voice shaky. "I just do financial analysis for corporate clients." "Sir, we'd prefer to discuss this somewhere more private," Agent Rodriguez said. Vanessa stood up, her wedding dress rustling. "No! Whatever this is about, you can say it here. This is my wedding day, and I deserve to know why federal agents are interrogating my husband." The agent looked uncomfortable, but nodded. "Mr. Hayes, we have evidence suggesting that Meridian Consulting has been engaged in industrial espionage and potentially compromising national security. Your role in the company's operations is being investigated." Marcus watched David's face cycle through emotions, confusion, realization, fear. But there was something else there, something that made Marcus's blood run cold. Recognition. David knew exactly what the agents were talking about. "I want a lawyer," David said quietly. "That's your right," Agent Rodriguez replied. "But I should inform you that we have a warrant to search your home and your office. We also have questions about your relationship with Katrina Volkov and your access to classified information through family connections." Family connections. Marcus felt the pieces clicking into place like tumblers in a lock. David had access to classified information through him, through casual conversations over family dinners, through Vanessa, through the trust that comes with being part of a family. Marcus looked at his sister, saw the dawning horror in her eyes as she began to understand the implications. Her new husband hadn't just been using her for cover, he'd been using her entire family. "Vanessa," Marcus said quietly, "we need to talk." But before anyone could move, Agent Rodriguez's partner stepped forward. "Mr. Cole, we'd like to speak with you as well, about your communications with Ms. Volkov." "I've never communicated with her," Marcus said, his voice stronger now. "But I think I'm beginning to understand how someone else did, using my identity." The ballroom had grown quiet around them, guests sensing the drama unfolding at the head table. The band had stopped playing. Vanessa stood frozen between her brother and her new husband, her perfect wedding day crumbling around her like sand. David looked at Marcus, and for a moment their eyes met. In that look, Marcus saw acknowledgement, guilt, and something that might have been an apology. But mostly he saw calculation, the mind of someone trying to figure out how much the authorities knew and how much he could still hide. "David," Vanessa whispered, her voice breaking, "tell me this isn't true. Tell me you didn't use our family to steal government secrets." David opened his mouth, closed it, then looked away. His silence was answer enough. Marcus felt a surge of rage so intense it took all his self-control not to grab David by the throat.
This man had systematically destroyed Marcus's career, his reputation, his security clearance, everything he'd worked for, and he'd done it from inside their family, using their trust as a weapon. "How long?" Marcus asked, his voice deadly quiet. David didn't answer. "How long have you been using my sister to get to me?" Marcus demanded louder now. Agent Rodriguez stepped between them. "Mr. Cole, please step back. Mr. Hayes, you need to come with us." As the Secret Service agents escorted David away, Vanessa sank into her chair, her wedding dress pooling around her like spilled cream. The guests watched in stunned silence as the groom was led from his own reception, federal agents flanking him like an honor guard in reverse. Marcus knelt beside his sister's chair, taking her hands in his. They were ice cold, trembling like autumn leaves. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry this happened to you." Vanessa looked at him.
Eyes that had aged years in the span of minutes. "He used me," she said, her voice hollow. "He used all of us. How long do you think he's been planning this?" Marcus thought about the timeline. When David and Vanessa had started dating, when David had first joined family gatherings, when the alleged communications with Katrina Volkov had begun. The pattern was becoming clear, and it painted a picture of manipulation that went back almost 2 years. "I don't know," he said, "but we're going to find out." The wedding reception dissolved into chaos as guests tried to understand what had happened and whether they should leave or stay. The wedding planner, to her credit, handled the situation with professional grace, arranging for the photographer to stop taking pictures and the catering staff to begin quietly cleaning up. Elena appeared at Marcus's side, having witnessed everything from across the room. "What can I do?" she asked simply. "Help me get Vanessa out of here," Marcus replied. "She doesn't need to deal with questions from relatives right now." They managed to get Vanessa to a quiet room in the country club, away from the whispers and stares. Marcus's parents arrived shortly after, having heard snippets of what had occurred, but not understanding the full scope of the betrayal. "I don't understand," his mother said, still in her mother-of-the-bride dress and matching hat. "David seemed like such a nice young man." "Nice young men don't usually get arrested by the Secret Service at their own wedding," Marcus said grimly. Over the next few hours, as the venue emptied and the reality of the situation sank in, more details emerged. Agent Rodriguez returned to speak with Marcus and his family, explaining that David Hayes had been under surveillance for several months as part of a larger investigation into Meridian Consulting. "We believe Mr. Hayes targeted your family specifically because of your security clearance," the agent explained. "He cultivated a relationship with your sister to gain access to you and your work environment. Vanessa, who had changed out of her wedding dress into jeans and a sweater, looked like a ghost of herself. So none of it was real. Our entire relationship was just part of some spy game. We're still investigating the full extent of his activities," Agent Rodriguez said carefully. "But it appears that gaining access to classified information was a primary motivation for the relationship." Marcus felt sick. His sister's heart had been collateral damage in someone else's intelligence operation. 2 years of her life stolen. Her wedding day ruined. Her trust in people probably shattered forever. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "Mr. Hayes will be charged with multiple federal crimes, including espionage and identity theft. The evidence suggests he used sophisticated techniques to spoof your phone number and create false communication records. We expect additional charges as the investigation continues. And my security clearance will be reviewed. Given the circumstances and the fact that you were the victim rather than the perpetrator, there's a good chance it will be reinstated. But these processes take time." Marcus nodded. Time. The one thing he couldn't get back. Months or possibly years of his career had been lost because someone had weaponized his sister's love against him. After the agents left, The Cole family sat in the empty country club, surrounded by the detritus of what should have been the happiest day of Vanessa's life. Wilted flowers, abandoned champagne glasses, a three-tiered cake that would never be properly cut. I feel so stupid. How could I not see it? How could I not know he was using me? Because you're not a spy. Because you trusted someone you loved. That's not stupid. That's human. But the cost. Look what it cost you. Your job, your reputation. Because I brought him into our family. Marcus took his sister's hands again, making sure she was looking at him. This is not your fault. Do you understand me? David is a professional manipulator. This is what he does for a living. You're not stupid.
For falling for it. You're normal for believing that someone who claimed to love you actually did. But Marcus could see that his words weren't enough to erase the guilt and betrayal Vanessa was feeling. She'd been used in the most intimate way possible. Her emotions turned into weapons against her own family. Recovery from that kind of violation would take time, patience, and probably professional help. As they finally left the country club that night, Marcus realized that while his career might eventually be salvaged, his sister's ability to trust might be damaged for much longer. David Hayes hadn't just committed espionage, he'd committed emotional terrorism against an innocent woman whose only crime was falling in love with the wrong person. The drive home was quiet. Each family member lost in their own thoughts about how completely their lives had been upended. Marcus looked out the window at the suburban Virginia landscape, thinking about all the assumptions he'd made about his life, his security, his family's safety from the dangerous world he worked in. He'd spent years protecting government secrets from foreign adversaries, never imagining that the real threat would come from inside his own family, invited in through the front door and welcomed at the dinner table. The enemy hadn't needed to hack his computer or break into his office. They just needed to make his sister fall in love. As they pulled into his parents' driveway, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Attorney Morrison. Saw the news. This changes everything. Call me in the morning. Marcus turned off the phone and helped his sister out of the car. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and debriefings and the long process of rebuilding their lives. Tonight, they were just a family trying to make sense of how love had been turned into a weapon against them. But as he looked at Vanessa, still beautiful despite everything that had happened, Marcus felt something shift inside him. The confusion and self-doubt that had plagued him all week was crystallizing into something harder and cleaner: determination. David Hayes had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated what happens when you threaten a family that genuinely loves each other. Marcus had spent years learning how to protect his country from people exactly like David. Now he was going to learn how to protect his family from them too. The war was just beginning. The morning after Vanessa's wedding arrived with the weight of a funeral. Marcus woke in his childhood bedroom at his parents' house, having stayed the night to be close to his sister. The familiar room felt foreign now, like everything else in his life. The photos on the dresser showed a family that no longer existed in the same way, their trust fractured by someone who had systematically infiltrated their most private moments. Downstairs, his mother was making coffee with the mechanical precision of someone going through motions to avoid thinking. His father sat at the kitchen table reading news on his tablet, occasionally muttering under his breath about federal agents and ruined receptions. Vanessa was nowhere to be seen, though Marcus could hear water running in the upstairs bathroom, suggesting she was awake, but not ready to face the world. Marcus's phone had been buzzing since dawn with calls from reporters who had somehow gotten hold of the story. Government workers' wedding ends in federal arrest was trending on local news sites. The last thing their family needed was media attention, but the combination of espionage, betrayal, and a wedding day arrest was too juicy for journalists to ignore. Attorney Morrison called at 8:30 sharp. Marcus, we need to meet immediately. The arrests last night have changed the entire landscape of your case. I've been in contact with federal prosecutors, and they're ready to discuss dropping all charges against you in exchange for your cooperation in building a case against David Hayes and Meridian Consulting. Marcus felt a surge of relief, followed immediately by anger. So they know I'm innocent, but they still destroyed my career first and asked questions later?
"Welcome to federal law enforcement," Morrison said dryly. "Justice and efficiency don't always align. The important thing now is that we can prove your innocence definitively and likely get your security clearance reinstated within months rather than years." Marcus agreed to meet her at 10 o'clock, but first he needed to check on Vanessa. He found her in the garden behind their parents' house, still in the clothes she'd changed into the night before, sitting on the wooden swing their father had built when they were children. Her wedding ring was gone, he noticed, leaving just a pale band of skin on her finger. "How are you holding up?" he asked, settling beside her on the swing. Vanessa stared at the rose bushes their mother had planted decades ago. "I keep replaying everything, looking for signs I missed. How did I not see it, Marcus? How was I so blind?" "Because he was a professional," Marcus said gently. "This wasn't some amateur operation. These people trained for years to manipulate targets. You weren't supposed to see it." "But there had to be something, some moment where his mask slipped." Marcus had been thinking about this too, analyzing his memories of David through the new lens of knowing who he really was. There were things that seem obvious now but didn't at the time. He was always asking casual questions about my work. Nothing that seemed inappropriate, just the kind of interest you'd expect from family. But he remembered details that most people would forget. Vanessa nodded slowly. "He did ask a lot of questions. About you, about your schedule, about when you traveled for work. I thought he was just trying to be a good brother-in-law. He was gathering intelligence, building a profile of my routines, my vulnerabilities, my access patterns, and you were his unwitting source." The words hung in the air between them. Marcus watched his sister process the full scope of how she'd been used, her face cycling through grief, anger, and something that looked like shame. "I gave him everything. Information about our whole family. I told him about Dad's retirement accounts, Mom's medical appointments, your girlfriend's job. I painted a complete picture of our lives for someone who was using it to destroy you." Marcus put his arm around her shoulders. "Nessa, listen to me. You did what any person in love would do. You shared your life with someone you trusted. That's normal. That's healthy. The fact that he betrayed that trust doesn't make you responsible for his crimes." But even as he said the words, Marcus could see that Vanessa wasn't ready to forgive herself. The violation was too fresh, too complete. David hadn't just stolen government secrets. He'd stolen 2 years of her life, her dreams of marriage and family, her ability to trust her own judgment about people. Marcus's phone rang, interrupting their conversation. The caller ID showed a number he didn't know, but the area code was local. "Mr. Cole? This is Detective Sarah Chen with the Arlington Police Department. We've been working with federal authorities on the David Hayes case, and we'd like to speak with you about some additional evidence that's come to light." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. "What kind of evidence?" "Surveillance footage from your apartment building and other locations. We believe Mr. Hayes may have been conducting physical surveillance of you and your family for longer than initially suspected. Can you come to the station this afternoon?" After arranging to meet Detective Chen at 2 o'clock, Marcus returned to the swing where Vanessa was still sitting, looking like she'd aged a decade overnight. "More complications?" "They think David was watching us for months, maybe longer. Physical surveillance, not just the electronic stuff." Vanessa shuddered. "How many times was he in our parents' house? How many family dinners, birthday parties, holidays? All of it was just him gathering information?" Marcus didn't have an answer that would make her feel better. The investigation was revealing layers of deception that went deeper than anyone had initially realized.
Hayes hadn't just been a husband and son-in-law, he'd been a spy embedded in their family structure, recording their conversations, photographing their documents, mapping their relationships and vulnerabilities. The meeting with Attorney Morrison was productive but sobering. The federal prosecutors were indeed ready to clear Marcus of all charges, but they wanted his full cooperation in understanding how David had gained access to classified information. This meant Marcus would need to undergo extensive debriefing sessions, polygraph tests, and security reviews that could take months to complete. "The good news," Morrison explained, "is that this actually strengthens your position for eventual reinstatement. You're not just innocent,
You're a victim of a sophisticated foreign intelligence operation. That makes you sympathetic rather than suspicious in the eyes of security clearance adjudicators. The bad news? Marcus asked. This case is going to be very public. David Hayes isn't just any defendant. He's connected to what appears to be a broader network of operatives working for foreign interests. The media attention will be intense, and your family will be in the spotlight whether you want to be or not. Marcus thought about Vanessa, already devastated by the personal betrayal. Adding media scrutiny to her trauma seemed unbearably cruel, but there wasn't much choice in the matter. The story was too big, too unusual for the press to ignore. The afternoon meeting with Detective Chen revealed even more disturbing details. Surveillance footage from Marcus's apartment building showed David entering the building on multiple occasions when Marcus wasn't home. Security cameras from nearby businesses captured him photographing license plates in the parking lot, apparently documenting which cars belonged to which residents. We believe he was conducting what's called lifestyle assessment, Detective Chen explained, showing Marcus a series of photographs taken from various cameras around the city. Mapping your routines, identifying your associates, looking for additional vectors of approach. The photos were chilling in their thoroughness. David at the coffee shop Marcus frequented, David in the parking lot of Marcus's gym, David sitting in his car outside Elena's apartment building. The man had been everywhere, documenting Marcus's life with the patience of a professional hunter studying prey. How long? Marcus asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Based on what we found so far, at least 18 months. Possibly longer. 18 months. That meant David had been surveilling Marcus almost from the beginning of his relationship with Vanessa. Their courtship, their engagement, their wedding planning, all of it had been conducted under the watchful eye of someone gathering intelligence for foreign interests. Marcus drove home that evening feeling like his entire life had been an illusion. Every family gathering, every casual conversation, every moment of trust and intimacy had been recorded, analyzed, and exploited by someone they'd welcomed into their most private spaces. Elena was waiting for him at his apartment with takeout from his favorite Thai restaurant and a bottle of wine. She listened patiently as he described the day's revelations, asking thoughtful questions and offering support. But Marcus could see the strain in her eyes, the way she processed each new detail as if calculating the cost to their relationship. "This is going to get worse before it gets better, isn't it?" she said finally. Marcus nodded. The trial alone could take years, and that's assuming they catch everyone involved. This wasn't just David, he was part of a larger operation. Elena was quiet for a long moment, swirling wine in her glass. "Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course. Is there any chance that I'm being watched too? That someone might be using me the way they used Vanessa?" The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on his family's victimization that he had
Considered the possibility that the surveillance and manipulation might extend to Elena as well. She was, after all, another vector of approach to him, another source of personal information and emotional leverage. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but we're going to find out." The next few days blurred together in a haze of interviews, debriefings, and security assessments. FBI agents questioned Marcus about every aspect of his relationship with David, every conversation they'd had, every piece of information David might have gleaned from family interactions. The process was thorough, invasive, and emotionally exhausting. Meanwhile, Vanessa was undergoing her own ordeal. Federal agents needed to understand exactly what information she'd shared with David, which meant reliving every intimate moment of their relationship through the lens of potential intelligence gathering. She'd moved back into their parents' house temporarily, unable to bear being alone in the apartment she'd shared with David. Marcus found her there one evening, sitting in their father's study, surrounded by boxes of documents and photographs. She was going through every piece of correspondence, every photo, every memento from her relationship with David, looking for clues she'd missed. "Look at this," she said, holding up a photo from their first vacation together. "He's not looking at the camera. He's looking at something behind me. I thought he was just distracted, but now I wonder if he was photographing something else entirely." Marcus studied the photo. In the background, barely visible, was a military base they'd driven past on their way to the beach. It was probably nothing, but in the context of what they now knew about David, every detail seemed potentially significant. Nessa, you can't analyze every moment of your relationship looking for spycraft. You'll drive yourself crazy. I'm already crazy, she replied. I married someone who doesn't exist. I made love to someone whose name probably isn't even David Hayes. How do I come back from that? Marcus didn't have an answer. The psychological damage from this kind of betrayal was profound and long-lasting. Vanessa wasn't just dealing with a broken marriage. She was dealing with the revelation that her entire perception of reality had been manipulated by a professional intelligence operative. 2 weeks after the wedding that never was, Marcus received a call that changed everything again. Agent Rodriguez from the Secret Service was on the line, his voice carrying an urgency that made Marcus's blood run cold. Mr. Cole, we need you to come to the federal building immediately. We've arrested additional members of the Meridian Consulting Network, and we've discovered evidence that suggests your family may still be in danger. Marcus felt his world tilt again. What kind of danger? We believe David Hayes was planning to extract additional information from you and your family before disappearing. His arrest may have accelerated that timeline. We're recommending immediate protective measures for you and your relatives. Protective measures? Marcus's mind raced through the implications. Witness protection? Relocation? How completely was this going to destroy their lives? An hour later, Marcus sat in a secure conference room at the FBI field office, listening to Agent Rodriguez and 2 other federal officials explain the scope of the threat against his family. The investigation had revealed that David Hayes was part of a cell of at least 6 operatives, all working to penetrate different aspects of the defense and intelligence communities. Mr. Hayes was specifically tasked with long-term penetration of your family structure, Agent Rodriguez explained. His handlers were planning to use your sister's emotional attachment to him as leverage against you for years to come. Leverage how? Marcus asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. They were going to threaten her safety to coerce your cooperation. Once they had sufficient compromising material on you, they would have forced you to provide ongoing intelligence or face the consequences to your family. Marcus felt sick. The plan was diabolical in its simplicity and cruelty. By making Vanessa fall in love with David, the operatives had created a hostage situation that could have lasted indefinitely. Even if Marcus had discovered the espionage, he would have been powerless to stop it without putting his sister in danger. "What's the current threat level?" Marcus asked. "High. We've disrupted their immediate plans, but we haven't captured all the operatives. There's a significant possibility they'll attempt to silence witnesses or extract revenge for the operation's exposure." The next few hours were a whirlwind of security briefings and protection protocols. Marcus's entire family would need to alter their routines, avoid predictable patterns, and maintain constant communication with federal authorities. It wasn't quite witness protection, but it was close enough to feel like imprisonment. Elena was brought in for her own security briefing, and Marcus watched her face as agents explained that she, too, was potentially at risk simply by virtue of her relationship with him. The strain in her eyes deepened, and Marcus realized he was watching the relationship fracture in real time under the weight of circumstances beyond their control. That evening, Marcus sat in his parents' living room with his family, all of them trying to process the new reality of their lives. His father had taken indefinite leave from his job. His mother had suspended her volunteer work at the hospital. Vanessa hadn't left the house in days. Their world had contracted to the size of a suburban home under federal surveillance. "I keep thinking about the wedding photos," Vanessa said quietly. "Hundreds of pictures of me dancing with someone's real name I don't even know. Smiling at someone who was using me to destroy my own brother." Marcus looked at his sister, her face gaunt from stress and lack of sleep, and felt a rage so pure that it was almost clarifying. David Hayes and his handlers had done more than steal government secrets. They'd committed emotional terrorism against innocent people whose only crime was loving each other. "We're going to get through this," Marcus said, his voice carrying a conviction he didn't entirely feel. "We're going to testify at their trials, we're going to help put them away, and we're going to rebuild our lives." "How?" Vanessa asked. "How do I ever trust anyone again? How do I have a relationship knowing that the last one was completely fake?" Marcus reached for his sister's hand. "Because the alternative is letting them win. They want us broken, isolated, afraid to trust each other or anyone else. If we give them that, they've accomplished their mission, even from prison." But even as he spoke the words, Marcus could see the damage that had been done. Vanessa's ability to form intimate relationships had been weaponized against her family. Her parents' comfortable retirement had been shattered by the revelation that their son-in-law was a foreign spy. Elena was pulling away, unwilling to accept the risks that came with loving someone who'd been targeted by professional intelligence operatives. The costs of David Hayes' operation went far beyond classified documents or national security. He'd shattered a family's ability to trust, to love freely, to believe in the basic goodness of people. That kind of damage couldn't be prosecuted in federal court or fixed with witness protection programs. Late that night, Marcus stood in the backyard of his childhood home, looking up at stars that seemed impossibly distant. His phone buzzed with another message from a reporter, another request for an interview about the spy who infiltrated his family. The media was already calling it the wedding day espionage case, turning their trauma into entertainment for people who would forget about it within a week. Marcus deleted the message without reading it and turned off his phone. Tomorrow would bring more interviews, more security briefings, more reminders of how completely their lives had been upended by someone they'd trusted. But tonight, standing in the garden where he'd played as a child, Marcus made a promise to himself and his family. They weren't going
to just survive this. They were going to make sure it never happened to anyone else. David Hayes and his network had made a critical error in their targeting. They'd attacked a family that included someone who understood their methods, their motivations, and their vulnerabilities. Marcus had spent years learning how to protect national security from people exactly like them. Now he was going to learn how to protect families from them, too. The war was far from over, but Marcus was no longer fighting just to clear his name or save his career. He was fighting to ensure that no other sister would dance at her wedding with someone whose love was a lie. No other family would welcome a spy into their most intimate moments. No other person would have their capacity for trust turned into a weapon against the people they loved most. Agent Rodriguez had been right about one thing. This case was going to be very public. But Marcus was beginning to realize that might not be entirely bad. The more people who understood how these operations worked, how families could be infiltrated and manipulated, the harder it would be for foreign intelligence services to repeat David Hayes' success. The confrontation was just beginning, and Marcus intended to make sure his family's suffering served a larger purpose. Justice wasn't just about prosecuting the guilty. It was about protecting the innocent from becoming victims in the first place. As he walked back toward the house, Marcus could see Vanessa silhouetted in the kitchen window, making tea with the same mechanical precision their mother had shown that morning. The healing would take time, patience, and probably professional help. But they were still a family, still capable of protecting each other, still worth fighting for. David Hayes had underestimated what happens when you attack people who genuinely love each other. That mistake was going to cost him everything. And Marcus was going to make sure the lesson was clear enough that no other intelligence operative would be tempted to repeat it. The real confrontation wasn't in a courtroom or a federal building. It was in the daily choice to keep trusting, keep loving, keep believing in each other despite everything they'd been through. And that confrontation, Marcus was determined to win. 6 months after the arrest, Marcus stood in a federal courthouse wearing his best suit, preparing to testify against the man who had destroyed his family's peace of mind. The trial of David Hayes and the Meridian Consulting Network had drawn national attention, with security experts and intelligence professionals watching closely to understand how such a comprehensive infiltration had been possible. The courtroom was packed with reporters, federal agents, and family members of other victims who had come forward once the case became public. Marcus had learned that his family wasn't unique. David Hayes and his associates had targeted at least 12 other families, with members who had security clearances, creating an extensive network of human intelligence sources throughout the defense establishment. Vanessa sat in the gallery behind the prosecution table, her presence a source of both strength and pain for Marcus. She'd insisted on attending every day of the trial, saying she needed to face David one final time and see justice served. But Marcus could see the toll it was taking on her. She'd lost 30 pounds since the wedding, her face drawn and her eyes carrying shadows that hadn't been there before. Elena was notably absent. She'd ended their relationship 3 months earlier, unable to handle the constant security concerns and media attention that came with being connected to Marcus. The breakup had been amicable, but painful, another casualty of David Hayes' operation that would never be prosecuted in any courtroom. When Marcus was called to testify, he walked to the witness stand with measured steps, making eye contact with David for the first time since the wedding. The man who had once been his brother-in-law looked smaller somehow, diminished by the orange jumpsuit and the weight of federal charges. But his eyes still had that manipulative glint, held the calculating intelligence that had made him so effective as a spy. The prosecution attorney, Jennifer Walsh, guided Marcus through his testimony with practiced efficiency. He described his work at the Defense Intelligence Agency, his security clearance level, and the access he had to classified information. He explained how he'd first learned of the charges against him, the confusion and terror of being accused of espionage, and the gradual revelation that his own family had been infiltrated by foreign operatives. "Mr. Cole," Attorney Walsh said, "can you describe your relationship with the defendant before you learned of his true identity?" Marcus looked at David again, remembering family dinners and holiday celebrations, the man who had seemed genuinely interested in becoming part of their family. "I considered him a brother. He was dating my sister, and he seemed like someone who genuinely cared about her. He asked thoughtful questions about our family, our interests, our lives. He remembered details that showed he was paying attention. At the time, I thought it meant he was a good partner for my sister." "Were you aware that he was gathering intelligence about your work and personal life?" "Not at all. His questions seemed like normal family conversation. He never asked directly about classified matters, never pressed for specific details about my job. He was much more subtle than that." The defense attorney, Marcus had been warned, would try to paint David as a low-level operative who had been manipulated by his handlers. The strategy was to portray him as a victim of the larger conspiracy, rather than an active participant in the destruction of American families. During cross-examination, the defense attorney did exactly that. "Mr. Cole, isn't it true that my client never directly asked you for classified information?" "That's correct." "He never requested access to your workplace or your government computer systems?" "No." "He never offered you money or other compensation in exchange for secrets?" "No, he didn't." "So from your perspective, he was simply a man in love with your sister who showed normal interest in her family?" Marcus felt the lawyer's trap closing, but he'd been prepared for this line of questioning. "From my perspective at the time, yes, but understanding human intelligence operations, I now know that the most effective agents never ask direct questions. They build relationships, establish trust, and gather information through seemingly innocent conversation over extended periods of time." The defense attorney pressed further. "But you can't know for certain what my client's motivations were, can you? Isn't it possible he genuinely cared for your sister and the intelligence gathering was secondary?" Marcus looked at David again, searching for any sign of remorse or genuine emotion. What he saw was the same calculating assessment he'd noticed that night at the wedding, the mind of someone evaluating how much damage had been done and how much could still be contained. "No," Marcus said firmly. "Someone who genuinely cared for my sister wouldn't have put her through the trauma of learning that her entire relationship was a lie. Someone who cared about her wouldn't have used her trust as a weapon against her own family.
Whatever his original motivations might have been, he chose to continue the operation even when it meant destroying an innocent woman's ability to trust and love. The courtroom was silent for a moment. Marcus could see Vanessa in the gallery, tears streaming down her face, but her spine straight with dignity. She'd been broken by David's betrayal, but she wasn't defeated. When Vanessa took the stand the next day, her testimony was the most devastating of the entire trial. She spoke quietly but clearly about falling in love with someone who didn't exist, about sharing her life and her family's private information with a man whose affection was part of his job description. "I told him everything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "about my brother's work schedule, his travel plans, his girlfriend's job, our parents' financial situation."
Situation? I thought I was sharing my life with someone who loved me. I was actually briefing a foreign intelligence operative about my family's vulnerabilities. The defense attorney tried to shake her testimony, suggesting she might have misremembered conversations or misinterpreted David's interest in her family. But Vanessa had spent months reviewing every interaction, every conversation, every moment of their relationship through the lens of intelligence gathering. "I remember because I thought it was sweet," she said when asked about David's questions regarding Marcus's work. "He said he wanted to understand what was important to me, and Marcus's career was important to me. So I told him about the stress of security clearances, the travel requirements, the way Marcus had to be careful about what he said even to family. I thought I was helping him understand our family dynamics. I was actually providing operational intelligence about a government employee's lifestyle and security protocols." When David finally took the stand in his own defense, his testimony was careful and calculated. He admitted to working for Meridian Consulting, but claimed he'd been told it was a legitimate business intelligence firm. He acknowledged gathering information about Marcus and his family, but insisted he'd believed it was for corporate research, not foreign espionage. "I fell in love with Vanessa," he said, looking directly at her in the gallery. "That wasn't part of any operation. My feelings for her were real." Marcus watched his sister's face during this testimony, saw the flicker of hope and pain that crossed her features. Even after everything, part of her wanted to believe that some aspect of their relationship had been genuine. But the prosecution's rebuttal was devastating. They presented evidence of David's training in human intelligence techniques, his previous operations targeting other families, and recorded conversations with his handlers discussing the emotional manipulation of American citizens. One particularly damning piece of evidence was a performance evaluation that praised David for his ability to maintain long-term cover relationships despite emotional attachments to targets. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. David Hayes was convicted on all counts: espionage, identity theft, fraud, and conspiracy to commit acts against the United States. The judge sentenced him to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. As the verdict was read, Marcus felt a mixture of satisfaction and emptiness. Justice had been served, but it couldn't restore what had been taken from his family: Vanessa's trust, his own sense of security, their family's ability to welcome new people without suspicion. Those things couldn't be fixed by a prison sentence. The media attention following the trial was intense, but ultimately brief. The Wedding Day spy case became a cautionary tale discussed in security training courses and intelligence analysis seminars. Marcus found himself in demand as a speaker at conferences about family security and the human cost of espionage operations. But the real work of healing happened away from cameras and courtrooms. Vanessa entered therapy to deal with the psychological trauma of having her love weaponized against her family. Marcus's parents joined a support group for families of intelligence targets. Marcus himself worked with a counselor who specialized in helping government employees rebuild their careers after security incidents.
What appeared to be a foreign intelligence operation. His approach combined technical security measures with education about the psychological techniques used to manipulate human targets.
Vanessa's recovery was slower and more complicated. The trauma of discovering that her marriage was fake, that the person she'd planned to spend her life with had been systematically manipulating her emotions, left deep scars that took years to heal. She moved across the country to start fresh, taking a job with an environmental nonprofit in Oregon where no one knew her story. For a long time, she couldn't handle being around couples or attending weddings. The sight of people exchanging vows reminded her too viscerally of standing at an altar with someone whose love was a professional performance. But gradually, with therapy and time, she began to rebuild her ability to trust. Marcus visited her in Portland 2 years after the trial, finding her in a small apartment filled with plants and artwork, looking healthier than she had since before the wedding. They walked through a farmer's market, talking about everything except David Hayes and foreign intelligence operations. "I've been thinking about dating again," she said as they sat by the river, watching kayakers navigate the gentle rapids. "There's someone at work who's been asking me to coffee for months." Marcus felt a protective surge, the instinct to warn her to be careful, to run background checks and verify employment history. But he forced himself to stay quiet. Vanessa needed to rebuild her ability to trust, and that meant taking risks that might lead to pain. "How does that feel?" he asked instead. "Terrifying," she admitted, "but also necessary. I can't let what David did turn me into someone who's afraid to love. That would be letting him win in a different way." Marcus admired his sister's courage. She'd been through something that would have broken many people, but she was choosing to remain open to the possibility of genuine connection, despite the risk of being hurt again. Marcus's own romantic life remained complicated. The high-profile nature of the case and his new career in security consulting made him a potential target for future operations. He'd been on several dates over the past 2 years, but eventually he always found himself explaining the David Hayes case and watching potential partners calculate whether the risks were worth it. Most decided they weren't. Marcus couldn't blame them. Dating someone who'd been targeted by foreign intelligence services came with genuine security concerns that most people weren't equipped to handle. But there were compensations. Marcus's consulting work was meaningful and successful. He'd helped dozens of families and organizations protect themselves from social engineering attacks. His presentations at security conferences were well received, and he'd been invited to testify before congressional committees about the need for better protection of government employees' families. The work felt like a way of turning his family's trauma into something useful, a way of ensuring that other people wouldn't have to go through what they had experienced. Marcus's parents had also found ways to channel their experience constructively. His mother had become an advocate for support services for families of intelligence targets, working with victim services organizations to develop resources for people dealing with the aftermath of espionage operations. His father had written a book about recognizing social engineering attacks, which had become required reading in several corporate security training programs. 3 years after David Hayes' sentencing, Marcus received an unexpected phone call. The caller identified herself as Sarah Chen, a producer for a documentary film about foreign intelligence operations targeting American families. She wanted to feature Marcus's story as part of a broader examination of how espionage had evolved in the digital age. Marcus's initial instinct was to decline. His family had been through enough media attention, and he wasn't eager to relive the trauma
for public consumption. But Sarah explained that the documentary would focus on prevention and protection rather than sensationalism. "We want to show people how these operations work," she said, "so they can recognize the warning signs and protect themselves. Your family's story could help prevent this from happening to others." After consulting with Vanessa and his parents, Marcus agreed to participate. The documentary, titled The Enemy Within: How Foreign Spies Target American Families, aired on a major network and was later used as training material by intelligence agencies and law enforcement organizations. The film's impact exceeded Marcus's expectations. Dozens of families contacted him after seeing the documentary, sharing their own stories of suspicious relationships and potential intelligence gathering.
Several of these tips led to FBI investigations that uncovered additional espionage operations. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from a woman named Jennifer Morrison in Denver. She'd been dating a man for 8 months who claimed to work in international business consulting. After watching the documentary, she'd recognized several behavioral patterns that matched David Hayes' operational methods. "Your sister's story saved me," Jennifer wrote in an email to Marcus. "I was planning to move in with someone who I now realize was probably gathering intelligence about my husband's work at NORAD. The way you described the subtle questioning, the interest in family members' careers, the patient building of trust, it was exactly what I was experiencing." The FBI investigation triggered by Jennifer's report led to the arrest of another espionage network with connections to the same foreign intelligence service that had run David Hayes. The case demonstrated that Marcus's family's ordeal hadn't been an isolated incident, but part of a broader, ongoing campaign to penetrate American defense and intelligence communities through family relationships. 5 years after the wedding that never was, Marcus stood in the same Virginia country club where Vanessa was supposed to have married David Hayes. But this time, he was there for a different celebration: the wedding of his cousin David, his father's sister's son, who had chosen the venue without knowing its significance to Marcus's family. The irony wasn't lost on him as he watched another couple exchange vows in the same room where federal agents had arrested a foreign spy. But rather than feeling haunted by the memories, Marcus found himself appreciating how far his family had come. Vanessa had flown in from Portland for the wedding, bringing her boyfriend of 8 months, a park ranger named Tom, who knew her story and loved her anyway. She looked radiant in a blue dress, laughing at Tom's jokes and dancing with their cousins as if she had never forgotten how to trust. Marcus's parents were there too, looking more relaxed than they had in years. The constant security concerns had gradually faded as the intelligence agencies involved in the David Hayes case were disrupted and their operations exposed. The family had been able to return to something approaching normal life, though they remained more security conscious than they'd been before. Elena was also at the wedding, having maintained a friendship with Marcus despite their romantic relationship ending. She had married someone else the previous year, a teacher who worked far from the world of intelligence and espionage. They chatted easily during the reception, two people who had shared something significant, but had moved on to different lives. As Marcus watched the new couple dance their first dance as husband and wife, he reflected on how much he'd learned about resilience, recovery, and the importance of choosing to remain open to love despite the risks it entailed. David Hayes was serving his sentence in a federal prison in Colorado, his appeals exhausted and his intelligence career permanently over. The other members of the Meridian Consulting Network had received similar sentences, their operations dismantled, and
sources exposed. But Marcus knew that somewhere, other intelligence services were developing new methods of targeting American families, new ways of turning love and trust into weapons. The work of protection was never finished, but Marcus had found peace in the knowledge that his family's suffering had served a larger purpose. They'd helped expose a significant threat to national security, educated thousands of people about social engineering attacks, and prevented other families from experiencing the same betrayal. During the wedding reception, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message from a colleague at his consulting firm. Another potential client wanted to discuss protection against social engineering attacks, a tech company whose employees had been receiving suspicious approaches from people claiming to be romantic interests. Marcus smiled and put the phone away. The work could wait until Monday. Tonight was for celebrating his cousin's happiness, for appreciating his family's resilience, and for recognizing how far they'd all come from that terrible morning when he'd first learned his career was over. As the evening wound down and families began saying their goodbyes, Vanessa approached Marcus at the bar where he was settling his tab. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For believing it wasn't my fault. For helping me understand that I wasn't stupid for falling in love with the wrong person. For showing me that we could get through this together."
Marcus hugged his sister, remembering the broken woman who had sat in their parents' garden after her wedding day arrest, consumed by guilt and self-doubt. The transformation had taken years, but she'd rebuilt herself into someone stronger and wiser without losing her essential kindness. "We protected each other," Marcus said. "That's what families do." As they walked to the parking lot together, Marcus thought about the strange turns life could take. 5 years ago, he'd been a government employee with a security clearance and a quiet life. Then, a foreign intelligence operation had targeted his family, destroying his career and nearly breaking his sister's spirit. But from that devastation had come new purpose, new understanding, and ultimately, a different kind of success. Marcus's consulting firm was thriving, helping organizations and families protect themselves from the kinds of attacks his family had experienced. Vanessa had found love again with someone who knew her whole story and chose to stay anyway. Their parents had channeled their experience into advocacy work that was making a real difference. David Hayes had intended to destroy their family to serve their intelligence masters. Instead, he'd made them stronger, more aware, and more committed to protecting others from the same fate. Sometimes the most devastating betrayals revealed strength that people never knew they possessed. Marcus drove home that night to his townhouse in Alexandria, a place he'd chosen specifically because it had never been surveilled by David Hayes or his associates. The security system was state-of-the-art, but not because he lived in fear. Rather, it represented his professional expertise and his commitment to helping others avoid the vulnerabilities that had once made his family a target. On his kitchen counter was a wedding invitation that had arrived the previous week. A former colleague from the Defense Intelligence Agency was getting married, and Marcus had been invited to attend. The couple had asked him to give a toast about trust and security in relationships, drawing on his unique perspective about the intersection of love and intelligence work. Marcus opened his laptop and began drafting remarks for the speech. He wanted to talk about the courage it took to remain open to love in a world where trust could be weaponized, about the importance of building relationships strong enough to withstand the tests that life inevitably brought. But mostly, he wanted to talk about resilience, the ability to be broken by something terrible and still choose to put yourself back together, to remain capable of joy.
Connection, despite having experienced betrayal at its most profound level. The speech would be hopeful without being naive, realistic about the risks that existed, but ultimately optimistic about the human capacity to overcome them. It would honor what his family had been through, while celebrating what they'd become. As Marcus wrote, he thought about David Hayes and his federal prison cell, probably still believing he'd been serving some noble cause by manipulating American families. The man would never understand the real cost of his actions, not just the classified information he'd stolen, but the trust he'd destroyed, the love he'd perverted, the innocence he'd shattered. But David Hayes had also unwittingly created something he never intended, a family of survivors who had turned their trauma into strength, their vulnerability into vigilance, their pain into purpose. He'd made them targets, but he'd also made them protectors of others who might face similar threats. Marcus finished the speech and saved it on his computer. Tomorrow he would review it, polish it, maybe practice it in front of the mirror. But tonight, he was content to sit in his secure home, surrounded by the life he'd rebuilt from the ashes of David Hayes' betrayal, grateful for the family that had weathered the storm together, and proud of the work they were doing to ensure others wouldn't have to face the same tempest alone. The war against those who would weaponize love and trust was ongoing, but Marcus's family had won their battle. They'd reclaimed their lives, their sense of security, and their faith in each other. That victory, more than any court sentence or intelligence disruption, was the true measure of their triumph over the forces that had tried to destroy them. The months following the trial brought unexpected developments that Marcus hadn't anticipated. While the immediate crisis had passed and David Hayes was behind bars, the investigation had revealed connections to a much larger network than anyone had initially realized.
federal agents continued to uncover evidence of additional operations targeting defense contractors, military families, and government employees across multiple states. Marcus found himself in the unusual position of being both a victim and an expert witness in ongoing cases. His experience with social engineering attacks and his understanding of how intelligence operations targeted families made him valuable to federal investigators working to dismantle the broader network. The consulting firm he'd started was growing rapidly, but not in ways he expected. Rather than focusing primarily on corporate security, Marcus discovered there was enormous demand for services protecting individuals and families from sophisticated manipulation tactics. The David Hayes case had highlighted vulnerabilities that most people never considered. The possibility that a romantic partner, a new friend, or even a helpful neighbor might be gathering intelligence for hostile purposes. His first major client outside the government sector was Patricia Williams, a software engineer whose husband worked for a major defense contractor in San Diego. Patricia had contacted Marcus after watching the documentary about his family's experience, concerned about a pattern she'd noticed in her social circle. 3 different women have approached me at our kids' school events over the past 6 months, Patricia explained during their initial consultation. They all seem very interested in my husband's work, but they ask questions in ways that feel calculated rather than casual. One of them even suggested we should all go on vacation together to a resort she recommended. Marcus recognized the pattern immediately. Multiple operatives working in coordination, each establishing seemingly innocent contact with the target family, gradually building relationships that would provide access to sensitive information. It was a more sophisticated version of what David Hayes had done to his family. Working with Patricia's case, Marcus developed a systematic approach to identifying and countering social engineering attacks on families. He created protocols for recognizing suspicious behavior, established communication procedures for family members to share concerns about new relationships, and designed security measures that didn't require families to become paranoid or isolated. The success of Patricia's case led to referrals from other defense industry families, and soon Marcus was traveling across the country providing security assessments and training. Each case taught him something new about how foreign intelligence services were adapting their tactics to target American families. One particularly disturbing case involved the Henderson family in Northern Virginia. James Henderson worked for the National Security Agency, and his teenage daughter had been approached by someone claiming to be a college recruiter. The supposed recruiter had spent months building a relationship with the daughter, offering scholarship opportunities and career advice, while gradually extracting information about her father's work schedule, travel patterns, and home security arrangements. The operation had been sophisticated enough to include fake university credentials, a convincing cover story, and even staged meetings with other, quote-unquote, students who were actually part of the intelligence network. Only Marcus's systematic analysis of the recruiter's behavior patterns had revealed the deception before any serious damage was done. These cases reinforced Marcus's growing understanding that his family's experience with David Hayes wasn't an anomaly. It was part of a widespread campaign to penetrate American security through the most trusted relationships in people's lives. The enemy had evolved beyond traditional espionage methods and was now exploiting the basic human need for connection and belonging. Vanessa's recovery continued to be a complex process that unfolded in unexpected ways. She'd returned to Portland after the trial with a determination to rebuild her life, but the psychological impact of the betrayal continued to manifest in ways that surprised her. Simple activities like online dating or meeting new people at work triggered anxiety responses that took months of therapy to address. Her therapist, Dr. Rebecca Morrison, specialized in treating victims of sophisticated psychological manipulation. Through their sessions, Vanessa learned that her experience was similar to what cult survivors went through: the systematic erosion of personal judgment through calculated emotional manipulation by someone in a position of trust.
David wasn't just lying about his identity, Dr. Morrison explained. He was using advanced psychological techniques to shape your perceptions, your emotions, and your decision-making processes. The trauma isn't just from discovering the deception, it's from realizing that your own mind was being controlled by someone else. Understanding the clinical aspects of what had happened to her helped Vanessa begin to separate her natural emotional responses from the manufactured feelings David had created. She learned to recognize the difference between genuine intuition and the self-doubt that had been programmed into her through months of subtle manipulation. The process was complicated by the fact that some of her memories with David contained moments of what felt like genuine connection. Even knowing that his primary motivation was intelligence gathering, Vanessa couldn't entirely dismiss every interaction as completely fabricated. The uncertainty about which emotions had been real and which had been performed became one of the most challenging aspects of her recovery. Tom Patterson, the park ranger she'd begun dating in Portland, proved to be exceptionally patient with the complexities of her situation. He'd known about David Hayes before their first coffee date, having researched Vanessa online after she'd been introduced to him by a mutual friend. Rather than being deterred by her history, Tom had been impressed by her resilience and her willingness to remain open to new relationships despite the risks. I figure anyone who's been through
What you've been through and still has the courage to trust people is someone worth knowing, he told her on their third date. Besides, I've read enough about your case to know what to watch out for. If I start asking suspicious questions about your family's work, you'll know to run. Tom's humor about the situation helped Vanessa maintain perspective about her past, while building confidence in her ability to recognize genuine versus manipulative behavior. He was exactly what David Hayes had pretended to be, someone genuinely interested in Vanessa as a person, supportive of her goals and respectful of her boundaries. The contrast between the two relationships was both healing and occasionally painful. Tom's straightforward honesty highlighted just how manipulative David's approach had been, but it also demonstrated that healthy relationships were possible, even after experiencing such profound betrayal. Marcus's parents had their own journey of recovery and adaptation. The revelation that they'd welcomed a foreign spy into their family gatherings had shaken their confidence in their ability to judge people and protect their children. They'd begun attending a support group for families affected by espionage operations, discovering that their experience was more common than they'd realized. Robert Cole, Marcus's father, had initially struggled with guilt about not recognizing David's true nature. As a retired engineer who prided himself on analytical thinking, he'd been particularly disturbed by his failure to detect the deception. The support group helped him understand that intelligence operatives were trained specifically to fool people like him, educated, observant individuals who might normally be suspicious of strangers. These people don't succeed by targeting the gullible, explained Dr. James Chen, the psychologist who facilitated their support group. They succeed by being so sophisticated in their approach that even security professionals and intelligence analysts can be fooled. Your failure to detect David Hayes wasn't a personal failing. It was evidence of how advanced these operations have become. Margaret Cole, Marcus's mother, had channeled her anger about the situation into advocacy work. She joined a nonprofit organization that lobbied for better support services for families targeted by foreign intelligence operations, arguing that the government had a responsibility to protect not just the employees with security clearances, but their relatives who could be used as vectors of attack. Her work had led to congressional hearings about the adequacy of current security protocols and the need for expanded family protection programs. Margaret's testimony about the psychological impact of the David Hayes operation had been particularly influential in securing funding for mental health services for espionage victims. The media attention surrounding the case had created both opportunities and challenges for the Cole family. While the documentary and subsequent coverage had raised awareness about social engineering attacks,
It had also made them recognizable to strangers, who sometimes approached them with inappropriate questions or conspiracy theories. Marcus had been particularly troubled by a subset of people who seemed to view his family's experience as entertainment rather than tragedy. Social media posts about the case often included comments that trivialized the emotional damage or suggested that the family should have been more suspicious of David's intentions.
Emphasized that the goal wasn't to make people paranoid about every new relationship, but to help them recognize specific warning signs that might indicate professional manipulation. One of his most effective presentations had been at a suburban community center in Maryland, where he'd addressed an audience of military spouses concerned about their family's vulnerability to intelligence operations. The questions from the audience revealed sophisticated understanding of the challenges they faced, balancing security concerns with the need to maintain normal social lives and relationships. How do we teach our children to be cautious without making them afraid of everyone? Asked one mother, whose husband was deployed overseas with a special operations unit. Marcus had developed practical answers to these questions through his consulting work. He recommended family security protocols that were comprehensive but not oppressive, regular check-ins about new relationships, agreed-upon procedures for sharing concerns, and education about manipulation tactics that was age-appropriate for children. The key, he'd learned, was helping families develop what he called informed intuition, the ability to trust their instincts about people while also understanding the specific techniques that intelligence operatives use to overcome natural suspicions. As his consulting firm grew, Marcus had hired additional staff with backgrounds in intelligence analysis, psychology, and security operations. His team included former FBI agents, military intelligence officers, and civilian experts in social engineering defense. Together, they developed comprehensive protection protocols that were being adopted by defense contractors, government agencies, and private families across the country. One of his most significant contracts had been with a major technology company whose employees were being systematically targeted by what appeared to be a coordinated intelligence operation. Multiple employees had reported suspicious approaches from people claiming to be romantic interests, business partners, or social contacts. The pattern suggested a well-funded, professionally organized effort to penetrate the company's security through human relationships. Working with the company's security team, Marcus had developed a training program that educated employees about social engineering tactics without creating a climate of paranoia or distrust. The program included role-playing exercises, case studies based on real operations, and practical guidelines for recognizing and reporting suspicious behavior. The success of this program had led to contracts with other major corporations, government agencies, and educational institutions. Marcus found himself at the center of a growing field that bridged traditional security consulting with psychology and social dynamics. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of his work was the direct impact on individual families. Letters and emails from people who had avoided potentially dangerous situations after attending his presentations or reading about his family's experience provided constant motivation for continuing the work. One particularly moving message had come from Sarah Chen, a military wife in Colorado whose husband was stationed at NORAD. Sarah had recognized warning signs in a new friendship after attending one of Marcus's presentations, leading to the discovery of what turned out to be a sophisticated intelligence operation targeting military families in the Colorado Springs area. "Your family story literally saved my marriage and possibly my husband's career," Sarah had written. "I was beginning to think I was being paranoid about my new friend's questions, but your presentation helped me trust my instincts. It turned out my suspicions were completely justified." These success stories reinforced Marcus's belief that education and awareness were the most effective defenses against social engineering attacks. While technology could provide some protection, the ultimate defense was helping people understand how manipulation worked and how to recognize and resist the efforts of those who sought to exploit them.
Trusting their ability to recognize when something didn't feel right. The 5th anniversary of David Hayes' arrest provided an opportunity for Marcus to reflect on how completely his life had changed.
The quiet government career he'd once enjoyed was gone, replaced by a much more public role as an expert on family security and social engineering defense. The change had been traumatic initially, but he'd come to appreciate the broader impact of his current work. His consulting firm now employed 15 people and had offices in 3 cities. They'd helped protect hundreds of families and dozens of organizations from social engineering attacks. The training programs they developed were being used by government agencies, corporations, and community organizations across the country. But the personal cost of the transformation remained significant. Marcus's romantic life was still complicated by the security concerns that came with his history and his current work. Dating someone meant sharing the story of David Hayes and explaining the ongoing risks that might affect anyone in a relationship with him. Some potential partners were intrigued by the drama of his background, which was almost as concerning as those who were intimidated by it. Marcus had learned to be wary of people who seemed overly interested in the details of intelligence operations or who asked too many questions about his current security protocols. The irony wasn't lost on him that his experience being targeted by a social engineering operation had made him more suspicious of new relationships, potentially making him vulnerable to different kinds of manipulation. Finding someone who could navigate the complexities of a situation while maintaining appropriate boundaries had proven to be extremely challenging. Elena's marriage to her teacher husband had highlighted what Marcus had lost when their relationship ended. She'd found someone whose life was simple and straightforward, free from the complications of security clearances and intelligence operations. Marcus sometimes wondered if he'd ever be able to offer that kind of normalcy to a partner. But he'd also come to appreciate the unique perspective his experience had given him. Understanding how trust could be weaponized had made him more discerning about relationships, but it had also made him more grateful for genuine connections when they occurred. His friendship with Tom Patterson, Vanessa's boyfriend, had been one of the unexpected benefits of his family's recovery. Tom's background as a park ranger meant he understood the importance of patience, observation, and respect for natural processes, qualities that made him an ideal partner for someone recovering from psychological trauma. Through watching Vanessa and Tom's relationship develop, Marcus had learned important lessons about how healthy connections could flourish even in the shadow of previous betrayal. Tom's willingness to accept Vanessa's history without trying to fix her had provided a model for how future relationships might work for Marcus as well. The 6th year after the David Hayes operation brought new challenges that tested everything Marcus had learned about security and resilience. A former associate of David's, someone who had been in prison but later released on a technicality, began making indirect contact with members of the Cole family. The contact was sophisticated and legally ambiguous. Social media friend requests, apparent coincidental encounters in public places, and anonymous gifts delivered to family members' homes. Nothing that rose to the level of obvious harassment or threat, but clearly designed to create anxiety and demonstrate that the family remained vulnerable to surveillance and approach. Marcus's security training immediately recognized the pattern as psychological warfare, an attempt to destabilize the family's sense of safety and perhaps provoke them into taking action that could be used against them legally. But understanding the tactic intellectually didn't make it less disturbing to experience. Vanessa was particularly affected.
The subtle campaign of intimidation, she'd worked hard to rebuild her sense of security and her ability to trust her environment, and the renewed evidence of hostile attention threatened to undo years of psychological progress. "I thought this was over," she told Marcus during one of their weekly phone calls. "I thought once David was in prison and the network was disrupted, we could finally move on with our lives." Marcus understood her frustration, but his consulting work had taught him that recovery from intelligence operations was rarely linear or complete. The skills and networks that enabled these attacks were persistent, and the people who used them often harbored long-term resentments against those who had exposed their operations. Working with federal law enforcement, Marcus's security team developed a comprehensive response to the renewed harassment that balanced protection with the need to maintain normal lives. The approach included enhanced surveillance detection, improved communication protocols between family members, and careful documentation of all suspicious incidents. But perhaps most importantly, It involved helping the family understand that their experience was part of a larger, ongoing conflict between those who would exploit human trust for hostile purposes and those who worked to protect innocent people from such exploitation. The campaign of intimidation eventually ceased after several members of the harassment network were arrested for unrelated crimes. But the experience reinforced Marcus's understanding that the work he was doing wasn't just about individual cases. It was about a fundamental struggle over whether societies could maintain openness and trust in the face of those who would abuse those qualities. As Marcus approached the 7th anniversary of a sister's wedding day arrest, he reflected on how the experience had transformed not just his family, but his understanding of security, trust, and resilience. The naive faith in institutional protection that he'd once enjoyed was gone, replaced by a more sophisticated understanding of the threats that free societies faced. But rather than making him cynical or paranoid, the experience had deepened his appreciation for the courage required to maintain human connections in a world where trust could be weaponized. Every day, millions of people chose to remain open to new relationships, to welcome strangers into their communities, to share their lives with people they hoped were genuine. That choice, to remain trusting despite the risks, was what separated free societies from closed ones, democratic communities from authoritarian ones, human connections from purely transactional relationships. Marcus's work was ultimately about preserving that choice by helping people make it more safely and more wisely. The consulting firm continued to grow, but Marcus had begun to focus more on training and education than on individual casework. He developed relationships with universities, government training centers, and international organizations that were working to address the global problem of social engineering attacks on civilian populations. His expertise was increasingly in demand at conferences and policy discussions about the intersection of intelligence operations and civil liberties. The challenge was developing defensive measures that protected vulnerable people without creating a climate of suspicion that undermined the social trust that democratic societies required. It was complex work that required balancing competing priorities: security versus openness, protection versus freedom, caution versus connection. But Marcus had learned that complexity didn't have to mean paralysis. Understanding the nuances of the problem was the first step toward developing nuanced solutions. As he prepared for another speaking engagement, this time at a NATO conference on hybrid warfare and social engineering, Marcus thought about how far he'd come from the confused and frightened government employee who had received that termination email 7 years earlier.
Journey had been difficult, sometimes painful, and had required rebuilding almost every aspect of his life. But it had also revealed capabilities and purposes he'd never known he possessed. The work was meaningful in ways that his previous career, however important, had never been. More significantly, his family had not just survived their ordeal, but had been transformed by it into people who were stronger, wiser, and more committed to protecting others from similar harm. They'd turned their victimization into advocacy, their trauma into expertise, their pain into purpose. David Hayes was still serving his sentence in federal prison, his appeals exhausted, and his intelligence career permanently over. But the network he'd represented continued to evolve, developing new methods and targeting new victims. The work of protection and education would never be finished. That ongoing challenge no longer felt overwhelming to Marcus. Instead, it felt like a calling that had emerged from the worst experience of his life, a way of ensuring that his family's suffering had meaning beyond their personal recovery. Standing at the podium of yet another conference, looking out at an audience of security professionals, government officials, and academic researchers, Marcus felt the weight and privilege of his unique perspective. He was someone who had experienced sophisticated social engineering attacks from the inside, had lived through the destruction and rebuilding that followed, and had dedicated his life to helping others avoid or survive similar ordeals. The presentation he was about to give would cover technical aspects of intelligence operations, psychological principles of manipulation, and practical measures for protection. But at its heart, it would be about something simpler and more fundamental: the importance of remaining human in the face of those who would exploit our humanity against us.
That message, born from his family's darkest hour and refined through years of work and reflection, had become Marcus's contribution to the larger struggle for security, freedom, and trust in an increasingly complex world. It wasn't the career he'd planned, but it was the one that had chosen him, and he'd learned to embrace both its challenges and its rewards with equal determination. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.